fortunate to have Kirsten Carr here from Foresight Law and Policy. She, along with Reg Lichty, staff SCAC, and she's going to tell you a little bit about what the SCAC is for those of you who don't know, but following national things that are emerged nationally like CGSA, and she's been following it closely. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. And thanks all. I'm happy to be here with all of you. As Paul said, I'm currently at the Foresight Law and Policy, and I've been there about a year and a half. And prior to that, spent over a decade at CGSA, where I had an opportunity to kind of cross paths with many of you, and also work on the CGSA there as part of that experience. So wasn't the lead author, but a little firsthand knowledge of kind of how that feels going through that process. So as we said, this discussion is very well timed, given kind of the recent announcements about CGSA that we'll talk about a little bit more. What we thought might be helpful for today was to just kind of look back a little bit about what states have done in the past and kind of different types of approaches states have taken to CGSAs in recent years. And then given the timing that with the new announcement and having a little bit more information about what this coming round could look like, just touch on some highlights of what we've seen so far that can start to think about how that might inform what you all might be thinking in terms of applications for this year. So if you go to the next slide, as Paul mentioned, we have the opportunity to support the SCAC, which sounds kind of funny, but it's basically a group of organizations, Student-Centered Assessment and Accountability Coalition, which you can see why SCAC is a little easier than that, long mouthful, but a group of organizations that are all very much committed to moving towards assessment and accountability systems that support student-centered learning. And so it's kind of not a formal group, but we get together on a regular basis, come together on consensus on different issues. Frequently, members of the group will write letters, for example, in response to the IADA RFI, or we recently wrote a letter to the department about what we hoped to see in CGSA, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, put out resources and things like that. So it's really trying to, at the national level, bring some collaboration and then use that to kind of try to push the conversation forward, both with Congress and with the Department of Education. So if you go to the next slide, we can start to dig into the CGSA. The announcement about it was made, I guess, I don't know if it's formal or informal. The announcement about it was made with kind of an initial publication of a document that kind of starts to signal what will be in this year's award or competition. And we anticipate that that'll officially be published within the Federal Register, which kind of starts the clock ticking. We've heard as soon as tomorrow, but we'll kind of keep you posted on that. So I will dig into that in a minute, but thought, again, it might be helpful just in setting the stage to look back first before we look forward and think a little bit about what we've seen recently. So the last round of CGSA was awarded in August 2022. And for that one, they had combined several years of funding and were able to give 11 awards to 10 states. The max amount for that round was $3 million for up to 48 months. Most were close to that, with a few being a little bit under, depending on the context. And in that round, this is a very simplified language, but they had two absolute priorities, one related to multiple measures and one related to competency-based models. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, kind of those themes have remained in the competition that we're seeing coming forward for this year. So if you go to the next slide, we did some work as part of the SCAC work, and we developed a resource that we'll link to at the end, but really looking across like what have states done through CGSA. Part of what we were thinking about is how does CGSA relate to IADA? How are states kind of linking those together? What different types of things have states used the CGSA funding to try to put forward? And so we did an analysis of particularly the last couple of years of CGSA applications with a focus on the most recent round to just see like what types of things or what are the themes that we saw in terms of how states were approaching this. And we kind of bucketed the approaches into three different categories. So the first is kind of really redesigning an assessment system that, at least at the time of the writing of the application, the state was intending to eventually replace the current summative assessment. So trying to shift the full assessment and anticipating that whatever the new approach would eventually need to go through the peer review process, and that may actually require some flexibility in that peer review process to the extent that states were trying to kind of try something new or push the bounds a little bit on the more traditional approaches. The second category is kind of meeting a specific federal requirement. So particularly thinking about English language learners or students with disabilities and the assessments that are designed for those populations. So those are federal requirements but that take a little bit more of a traditional path. So trying to develop and improve an assessment, but without really trying to change the traditional approach in terms of needing added flexibility. The third bucket, and I'll give some examples of each of these in a second, is related to kind of building out a comprehensive assessment system. And so developing supplementary assessments that better support instruction as part of a coherent system. But those are more frequently kind of performance assessments or performance tests that support your science assessments or different types of things that aren't necessarily intended to replace the statewide summative, but just supplement it and provide more resources, more targeted towards educators and classroom practice. So if you go to the next slide, I'll give some quick examples of each of these, again, just to kind of give us some context for how states have been thinking about this in recent years. So this is the category of states where if the kind of initial planning that was described in the CGSA came to full scale, or was thinking a little bit differently about assessments that would eventually replace your statewide summative assessment. And I welcome and know many of you on this call may have more in the weeds and more details on some of these, but just kind of as a big picture, saying like, these are the types of things that we know states are moving towards that are trying to really change the comprehensive system. And if we go to the next slide, here are some examples of, as I said, one still kind of getting at some of those federally required assessments, but using potentially a more kind of traditional path and making improvements to assessments, but without really replacing whole scale the assessment approach. So for example, Iowa and Minnesota, we're developing alternate English language proficiency assessments. So really good use of the funding, but just a slightly different way to think about what they're trying to do within their states. And then if you go to the next slide, and then these are examples of states that are thinking about how to kind of provide supplementary assessments that better support instruction. And again, another great use of the funding that kind of helps states build out their comprehensive systems and how all those pieces fit together. Okay, so that's kind of a look back. So now as you start to think about what we've seen from the initial announcement that I think Paul shared in the chat, is looking at kind of what do we anticipate from this round? So just a couple of quick high level things, and then we can just offer some reflections on them. But the timeline, it looks like the states will have 30 days to give notice of intent to apply from the time it's published. And again, we anticipate that could be as soon as tomorrow. And then 75 days to apply. I think in the last round, it was a slightly a shorter time frame that then got extended. So I think hopefully, I know it's still a quick turnaround, but hopefully enough time for folks, if you're thinking about it, to have time to apply, but recognizing that clock starts ticking very soon. The language in the announcement was really put a big emphasis on connecting it back to the IADA feedback. So you may recall, as I mentioned, over the summer, the department had asked for feedback on the IADA process. And the SCAC, along with many others, kind of provided some feedback, tried to highlight some things that we thought could make improvements to that process. And as a result, the department came out with a letter that said, hey, here are some flexibilities and ways that you can think about IADA, where we think it gives you a little bit more room to do some of the things that you want to do. And so this announcement is, I think, another signal, clearly connecting it back to that IADA feedback that just kind of continues to show from the department, like that's an avenue they think is important. They want to try to see more states going on this path. They are trying to make it easier within kind of the statutory parameters that they have to work with. So kind of, I think, explicitly calling that out signals that. It also explicitly calls out through year, and as you can see, there's kind of some language about it here. And then in fact, there's kind of different sets of priorities, as you may know, but in the invitational priority, which actually doesn't seem to get you any more points, but is explicitly called out, they also there call out the through year assessment model. I know in the last round of CGSA, a couple of those states that we just had up on the screen used the funding to advance a 3-year model. I think Texas did, Montana, and I think some others. So it's interesting to kind of see that pattern that they're explicitly saying, like, hey, this is something that you can use the funding for. What they've currently included as the estimated available funds, you can see there, and maybe the line through it is appropriate because we're hopeful that, so that reflects the last, so fiscal year 23, I think let me get the numbers right, but the previous amount of funding that they already know they had allocated for this. So it's 1 year of funding. What they did in the past, the department did in the past, is combine 2 years of funding. They don't know yet what that funding will look like for this fiscal year 24. And so it's an open question as to whether, once that's confirmed, if they would then put that together with this pot of funding to increase that almost 19 million amount, or if they would hold a separate competition. So the reason that this amount looks like a lot less than the previous amount is because this is only 1 year's worth of allocated funding. So I think that's something to just keep an eye on as we go. If you could go to the next slide, please. So sorry, that spacing is a little messed up, but so this year, there are again 2 absolute priorities. And again, when you apply for the CGSA, you have to select at least one of the absolute priorities to kind of align your application to. So what it looks like this year they did is kind of took the absolute priorities from the previous CGSA competition and kind of put those together in this absolute priority 1. So looking at multiple measures, looking at the competency-based education models, and kind of calling that out as something they'd like to see continued applications pursue. The max budget for states that select absolute priority 1 is 4 million, which for up to 48 months. And if you go to the next slide, so this is new. I think very explicitly in absolute priority 2, they call out IADA. And again, I think just kind of continues this momentum towards saying, oh, looks like the department would really love to see some states kind of start to pursue this path. So in doing that, they talk about like how you could use CGSA as part of a planning process for IADA and trying to more deliberately align those 2 programs. As we know, IADA does not come with funding. And so by kind of putting these 2 together, it starts to say, here is some funding for states that might be interested in doing this, but don't have a source to do that. I will note though that, and you can see here, the max budget request for that is a smaller amount of 1 million, I think because they see it more as a planning process, and it's for up to 24 months. So if a state pursued just absolute priority 2, it's a little bit shorter timeline and a little bit less money, but presumably sets you on a longer term path towards IADA. So if you go to the next slide, we can do some reflections, and then I will pause to breathe and see if there are any questions, and then we can open it up to discussion. But just a few final thoughts on this. As I said, they kind of combined the priorities from the last time, continue to send strong signals about innovation, seeking to align CGSA and IDA more deliberately. So when the SCAC, this is something that the SCAC has talked about a lot. And when we wrote the letter I referenced to the Department of Education, this is something we kind of continue to say, how can we bring these programs together more effectively so that states have the resources they need and the time they need if they do want to pursue an innovative approach. You'll also see we have a resource actually that also kind of gets at those same issues, like how to kind of bring those programs together. They increased the cap slightly, so that 4 million amount is a little bit higher than the last time's 3 million amount, which is again also aligned with the SCAC recommendations. I think, and we welcome Paul to jump in or can share reflections. I think when the SCAC was trying to decide how to advise on this, it's a balance, right? Because we recognize that this type of change and the innovation that states are trying to do takes a lot of money. But if you increase the amounts, you potentially decrease the number of states that can benefit from them. So trying to think through what that right balance is in terms of given the limited pool of money that we have now, like what is the right amount that allows you to do what you want to do, but also allows multiple states to pursue different approaches. As I said, the overall amount is less, and particularly because last year was 2 years. One of the other things that the SCAC group has talked about a lot is kind of the intersection of assessment and accountability, and trying to think about how potentially you could open up the pilot concept to include a little bit more on accountability. This round did not explicitly talk about that, But we'll be interested to see if states kind of do link those together more as they think about these issues. I know, for example, Kentucky in the previous round had kind of been thinking about both of those more explicitly together. So that's something that we'll continue to think about, and as over time, continue to advocate for rules to allow more flexibility for accountability in addition to assessment. And then it didn't have too much of an express language around equity, which is again something else that the SCAC had recommended as part of our thinking about how we could continue to improve this process, which of course doesn't preclude it from being a part of an application, but just wasn't as explicitly called out as we might have hoped for. So let me pause there. Paul, I don't know if you want to add any reflections before we open it up to questions or comments.
No, I just know that this is really a fast-moving target.